Salaway, your mate, I am Ruminous, and today we are doing a review for Among the Sleep. This game I had beaten way back in October for the Scary Games thing. It kind of got away from me, other things got online, and you know what, I wrote the review, we're gonna do it, and also, this game's kind of bad, and most of the games I reviewed have been classics and pretty good games, so I need this to add my collection to show I do play and review bad games. Among the Sleep places us in the terrible care of a witch who wants to fatten us up for the slaughter. Our mother doesn't seem to understand portion control, gets a scolding from CPS, and we end up in a room with Mr. Teddy Bear. We begin to explore the house and realize it's filled with monsters. After we get separated from our mom, our goal is to traverse the wicked lands, escape some demon coats, and return to mom for safety, although our arteries would disagree. The game should take about 1 to 2 hours to beat on the first playthrough. I'd imagine a speedrun could probably be done in about 20 to 30 minutes. The controls in this game are seldom, but they are mostly consistent. I did have some issues with grabbing things, as sometimes it would just slip away from my tiny fingers. Going through narrow passageways was also forbidden sometimes, even though I could fit and have done so elsewhere many times. The run, climb, and hug controls worked as intended every time that I requested. The game's precision allows players to repeat actions with impunity, although they can't cancel out of an action and must wait until the current one is finished. For the game, there is no need or benefit to doing baby burpees, although my weight gain from the cake would love it. The game will allow the player to escape the grasp of the monsters within pretty close range, so escaping is actually pretty lenient. Restarting after failure is immediate and places the timer just before the encounter to make retrying quick and simple. The game has a bit of a build-up when selecting an action and performing it. However, this is intentional to fit with the theme of being a small toddler. Otherwise, actions and the game react immediately as designed, and I never had a problem where there was lag or input delay that wasn't designed. Most of the traversing verbs are frequently used, but the throwing and hugging verbs are hardly ever used or needed in the game. Running and grabbing things are the most used actions to get from one part of the level to the next. The traversing sections are useful throughout the game, but the hugging and throwing verbs are not. Throwing is only required at the very end of the game, which was annoying to me because I had forgotten completely about it. Hugging Teddy will illuminate the character for a bit, but the levels are bright enough to clearly see, so it's basically just a waste of time. The game also gives a peeking action, although the lack of monsters for the majority of the game, combined with the monsters being in wide open areas, makes the control useless. The game gives full autonomy to the player, only taking away control when the Super Saiyan Gorgon, Zemnis, or Mom get us. They're all short-lived, so they don't impede the gameplay much. The game otherwise allows the player to move and do however they wish. The character has a walk, crawl, and run option, although running for too long will cause the tiny knees to crumble and go back down to a crawl. Crawling is the fastest movement anyway, so the player should be doing that unless they really need to get a better vantage point. The character can climb on certain objects and drop from grand heights. Walking movements in directions other than forward is a little clunky, although again, kinda planned due to the fact that you're a child with unrefined motor skills. The game is first person with a free camera. The player can see decently far and wide enough to gauge a nearby area for whatever monsters may be lurking about. Crawling is the faster movement but limits the view considerably, especially in areas with grass. The game grows in spookage for a bit and the size of levels, although the larger levels and the lack of enemies really hinder any sense of change. The game feels stagnant for the first half and then finally has some tension and challenge, but still not too much, as the enemies are easy to avoid. The growth in the final area is actually good, as it grows with danger, tension, and the complexity of puzzles, but at that point, it's mostly just players who want to finish. All others have probably given up to play other games. The game barely changes until about halfway through the game, and even then, hardly does anything really different. There is a consistent threat of danger, but it only manifests itself in 2 areas. The sudden change of everything in the final area to include all mechanics and aspects of the game is nice, but jarring, as the rest of the game didn't require the throwing action, running away from enemies, navigating the large gaps. The game is not difficult, and I'm unsure if that was intentional. The developers clearly intended the game to not be brutal, but there are only really 3 enemy encounters, and they are easy to avoid, and the restart checkpoints are so forgiving that there's really no punishment or real risk of failure. I remember in my first playthrough failing once or twice, but only once in my second, so death really is not a risk. The game, despite its short playtime, is not really sustainable. The intro is paced well enough and decently horrifying with the zoom into the horrible mother's face, but the rest of the game is constantly instigating the player with sound effects and threats, but no payoff, jump scares, actual threats, or monsters. There are a few impediments and puzzles, but they are solved immediately and hardly require any thought. They are more of a nuisance than anything else. The enemies rarely show up, and they are easily outmaneuvered. The story has an important message, but is generic and has been told in countless media. The game's story is basic. Kid has a birthday from a divorced or separated mom, there's clearly some aggression and unresolved emotions, and the kid decides to hide from the scary monsters that appear during the rage. The environment changes to a dark place to reflect how the kid sees the world, which is nice, and there are subtle nods to the truth as to what is happening in the real world compared to the imagination world. The ending explains the truth of everything and shows that the mom is clearly in need of help. The sound in the game is realistic for all of the actual objects, like bottles breaking or the baby flopping down to a crawl. Many of the monster effects are exaggerated purposely to match the horror theme with high-pitched, loud notes. There's hardly any music in the game, and what is there is forgettable. It isn't bad, but it's not noteworthy. The game's mechanics are somewhat reliable, although at parts feel forced or changed to spice up the game. To traverse the lands, the baby will need to climb various heights and drop down convenient slides. The puzzles consist of finding the glowing objects placed in an area, placing them into a receptacle, and that's it. The obstacles are reliable, although the last area decides to shift and require aiming, actual thought, and hiding, which is never needed before. The game has no manipulative mechanics and doesn't need any. The checkpoints in the game are highly assistive, although too much. The checkpoints happen before every enemy encounter and let the player try again immediately, but then there is no danger after restarting and often places the enemy far enough away. Hugging the teddy bear will give a temporary flash of light, yet the levels are bright enough that it is practically useless. The story objects are all highlighted and glowing with radiation, which helps easily locate them, but once again, the pathways are all linear and this is hardly helpful. The detrimentals are well designed and implemented into the game, where looking at the monsters will blur the screen and create scary sounds to create tension and panic in the player. Crawling is the fastest movement, but gives the least amount of vision. Climbing objects takes a second due to my tiny limbs, which helps add to the tension that something may grab me, although that fear quickly dissipates when it is clear that nothing ever will. The darkness and foliage block the view, again adding to the atmosphere, but loses its luster when it is clear that nothing is patrolling to put me in timeout. The game has a few guiding mechanics, but doesn't need much based on the level design. The important objects are all glowing with supernatural energy, contrasting them against the dark world, and Teddy will point out exactly what we need to do when encountering an obstacle or puzzle. The levels have straight pathways, some of which are dead ends or circular, but they are rare. Most will lead into the next area or stop pretty quickly. There is no reason to explore other than to see the mother's obsession with trench coats, as the lights, oil, or stains of spicy grape juice will lead the way to the correct place. The game explains all the verbs in the introduction and explains the mechanics of the different movements directly. Some of the parts of the game are intuitive, but nearly every puzzle, movement, danger, threat, and point of interest is directly told to the player by Teddy and or by text on the screen. The explanations are not long and obstructive, but they do get in the way of the player trying to experiment with the game. The game's thematics are quite interlaced with the gameplay aspects and the other mechanics. The Nightmare Realm is clearly the kid's tiny brain trying to process everything that he is seeing and experiencing. Everything is exaggerated and easily explained, but to the small human, it is a Gorgon trying to give him a hug. Running for a bit will cause the character to flop down, which makes sense for a toddler's terrible motor skills, and trying to climb as high as possible is an innate desire that all children and cats have. The tutorial is thematically matched into the game, where the mom goes to put the baby into a crib, but the baby of course refuses, as there are toys to play with. The game explains every action possible with little opportunity for the player to experiment or just play the game. The design railroads the player into doing certain actions and explaining what those actions are used for. The game's design lends itself to easily be digestible to the player. The area has large objects to show clearly where the edge of the map is, and landmarks with contrasting colors to show what can be changed. There is no map or HUD, but the levels are small and straightforward enough that they are not needed. There is an inventory, which is annoying to use and completely unnecessary, as there are only 4 objects that the player needs to equip, and this could have easily been done by simply allowing the player to use that object with a button prompt when they interact with the receptacle. The start and option menus are the only menus present, and the menu is white text against a contrasting background and has a few options, but they all make sense. The menus are navigable and simple enough to not cause problems. The game's visual style is mostly realism, although many of the nightmare parts are intentionally exaggerated in scale or dimensions. The mother's proportions make her look human, but the face seems oddly pointy. The giant dressers are clearly dressers, just stretched out to make it seem to the player how a child would actually see these giant pieces of furniture. The graphics themselves are low, but fine. The visual clarity is enough to tell objects apart and what they are supposed to be. The graphics make things look kind of like clay at times, but it doesn't make anything look necessarily fake, uncanny, or out of place. The animations are typically fine, especially since most are in first person, so all we see are the tiny hands flying about, but the movement of the damp Bigfoot is a little goofy due to the size of the intense caps, and the floating coat is just laughable. The game is quite accessible as most of it is not timed or requiring absolute perfection to beat. There are no options to change the typeface, font, or text in any way, which can cause lexical issues. The plethora of shadows can potentially cause issues for colorblindness or people with visual impairment, although there are options for brightness which may help. The vibration can be turned off, which can be helpful for anybody with motor disabilities. The different standing types could potentially help with spatial issues, but the game is not so tense that I feel many with such disabilities would struggle to play this game. For a final score, I give the gameplay a 19 out of 35, story 3 out of 5, sound 3 out of 5, mechanics 21 out of 30, tutorial 2 out of 5, UI UX 4 out of 5, visuals 4 out of 5, and accessibility 3 out of 5. Overall, I'll give the game a 2 out of 5. The game offers little spooks, little engagement, little uniqueness, and little change. It is essentially a walking simulator with a dark environment and generic story. The game isn't necessarily bad, but it is lacking in its core themes and any challenge to the gameplay. The last area is the best part of the game, but I feel like it's not worth it to sludge through the rest of the game just for this one good part. It hardly has or uses any opportunities for its major aspects or mechanics, and the monsters are hardly ever present. In essence, it really isn't unique or does anything spectacular to make it a worthwhile horror game. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. But until next time, wale te omnes.